Welcome to the latest episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Before we get started, we're doing our monthly book giveaway. This month's winner is Jeffrey Vincent. Jeffrey, congratulations. As usual, you'll have a choice of one of three books. The first book is actually the book of the author we'll be interviewing today, Joshua Specht. It's Red Meat Republic, a Hoof-to-Table history of how beef changed America. And it's really good commodity history of beef in the United States and the ways beef was produced, who produced it, who owned the cattle, who owned the land. There's environmental history there. There's the history of the destruction of the Native Americans in the West. There is the rise of Chicago. It's very solid history, as I'm sure this episode will probably lay out, so that's one of the options. Another option is Lars Schultz's Beneath the United States, A History of U.S. Policy Towards Latin America. It's a very good overview. I'm about halfway through it myself, and I'm really enjoying it. And it's a really good, basically a summary of like all of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, going back to the early 19th century. And the final book is a book I just picked up. I have yet to read it, but it looks really interesting. It's Jeffrey Parker's Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century. Basically, there's among a lot of modernist historians, there's this idea that the 17th century, especially in Europe, was one of crisis. There was a crisis period which is bookended by the growth of the 16th and 18th centuries. And one of the things that plays into that is the constant war that marked the 17th century, climate change, the mini ice age of the 17th century, and other issues. Now, I'm interested in this book because it purports to be a global crisis. So that kind of global history is really interesting to me, so I thought maybe that would be interesting to you as well. So you have those three choices. You have Schultz, Beneath the United States, Parker's Global Crisis about the 17th century, and Specht's Red Meat Republic. Alright, so if anyone would like to be entered into the monthly raffle, all you have to do is donate to the podcast on our Patreon. With that said, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. We're here today with Professor Joshua Specht. He is continuing lecturer at Monash University. Continuing lecturer is equivalent to an assistant professorship. And today we'll be talking about his book, Red Meat Republic, A Hoof-to-Table History of How Beef Changed America, out of the Princeton University Press, 2019. Professor Specht, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Andres.
Thanks for coming on. So before we get started, I always like to ask, what first got you interested in history?
In history? Oh, that's a good question. I think what I like about history is that you can really write about anything as long as it was in the past. So it was both the ability to study whatever interested me and then just having really great professors when I was an undergraduate. I went to William & Mary in Virginia. And one of my first professors was Scott Nelson, who is a labor historian of the American South and kind of history of capitalism person. And he was just such an amazing professor. I got really excited about it.
Oh, cool. There's also kind of like a history of capitalism thing going on now with like people like Sven Beckert and stuff like this. I take this as like an older school of history of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, he was studying kind of labor and production and questions of capitalism, for a long time. I mean, when I was taking this class was more than 10 years ago, but now he's kind of tapped into some of that stuff.
Ah, cool. Because like the one coming out of Harvard is more like a business history angle of capitalism, while you're describing a much more labor history kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I think, I was in kind of an interesting spot because then I was interested in those kinds of questions of labor and business. And then when I went to Harvard for grad school, I got to know some of the people doing that kind of approach. And as the history of capitalism stuff was coming together, and while I don't push it too much in the book, I think this book is very much reflective of this history of capitalism kind of trend.
Yeah. And what made you decide to look at the a commodity history of beef production in the U.S.?
Well, I got some good advice. So this grew out of my dissertation, and I got some pretty good advice when I was thinking of a dissertation topic. And someone basically said that whatever topic you pick, you're going to be sick of it by the end. So really pick something you're excited about. And I had a different topic that I think was very good. I was kind of moderately excited about it, but it was kind of technical. And so I thought, well, I also am really curious about food. And I'd been reading about food production kind of in my free time. And I thought, well, maybe I should do that because that would let me get something I feel a connection to and I'm excited about. And now it's been 7, 8 years later, I'm still not tired of it.
Oh, great. It sounds like you made a good call.
I think so.
So we can safely call it a commodity history, correct? Yeah.
I think so.
And what strikes me as really interesting about it is that it really interweaves a lot of different aspects of history that are... I don't think that all of the threads you touch on are always brought together in the same way. Like, sometimes you'll read a commodity history which touches on, for example, the more business side, the more labor side, but not necessarily environmental history, and others which touch on maybe environmental history, but don't get into, for example, you talk about the wars against Native American nations. You kind of interweave all these different threads together. Is there anything that influenced you to bring all these together in this one, in your book?
No, I think that's a really important question. I think I take a kind of kaleidoscopic view, and I try to kind of weave these things together, in part because I kind of concluded that this beef system relies on all these different stories, right? You can't talk about the story of the railroads without talking about where the land came from. You can't talk about power on the plains without looking at ecological changes. And the other recognition is, when you're writing a kind of original contribution and piece of research, you look at the existing literature, and what I realized is there's a lot of fantastic work on every individual piece of this. And I thought the way I could add value was looking at how it all interlocks and rests on each other in terms of the power of this beef system, and the commodity approach is the best way to do that.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in your book that there's a lot of kind of histories written by people who basically work at maybe a company that's or industry, kind of like an intra-business history made by them, kind of idealizing maybe their role and such. But is this how many histories of what you're trying to do have been written?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of commodity histories would say they kind of set out to do what I'm doing. So I don't think it's totally original. I think for beef, I like to think of this as making a good contribution in terms of putting all the pieces together and thinking big picture. I do think what you're saying is kind of interesting. You see this in both kind of business history and history of science, in that the earliest works in both fields were kind of done by participant historians. So well-known scientists were some of the first historians of science. Well-known business people and kind of people working for businesses were some of the first business historians. Now, when you talk about business history, of course, this has a particular kind of political implication, because the earliest business historians are basically telling a triumph of business genius and technology while downplaying the rest of the story. And so what I was trying to do was actually kind of say, well, there's maybe something to what they're saying, but that kind of story of innovation and business savvy rests on exploitation. And so I tried to put that together.
So your book basically has, your book overviews several pretty different periods in terms of how beef is produced and consumed and transported and all the rest. And the earliest period that you really emphasize is the one where the United States is annexing all this Native American land, and the cattle ranchers are moving in. I had never really tied the idea of the decline of the bison, the annexation of land, and the rise of cattle together as kind of this is a kind of requirement for the expansion of cattle ranching in the United States.
Yeah, I think I was surprised that people hadn't put it as forcefully in the story. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. So I basically talk about how the period between 1865 and 1920 or so, Americans came to expect abundant and affordable beef. And the most obvious story is like a business one, right? You get railroads connecting places, you get changes like the disassembly line, you get markets. And so I think there's a way of telling that. And if you start to push it backwards, it kind of complicates the story because you have to think about where this land came from. And you also have to think about how the myths and ideas we have about beef and ranching shaped both our assumptions about the product and assumptions about America. And that's where you have to think about dispossession of American Indian lands.
I was surprised. As you say, it's kind of intuitive once you just think about it for a few seconds. What did really surprise me though was how the Native Americans were basically the destruction of the bison and their reduction into smaller and smaller pieces of land made them dependent on the federal government, but also that dependency also connected with, for example, you cite how ranchers would sometimes sell off their sick or small cattle, and so basically the U.S. government was subsidizing the cattle industry and then giving the meat at high prices or low quality to the Native Americans.
Yeah, I think this is an important trend I trace throughout the story. I don't know if you could find this elsewhere, but I constantly argue in the first part of the book that cattle ranching is both a tool of land dispossession and a justification. So it's a way of taking and occupying land by spreading cattle, and also the ideas about ranching end up justifying that process. Now you see the same thing during the kind of period after this, the period, or at least moments and places where there's supply going to reservations. What you see is deliberate policy on the part of the state and ranchers has taken land away from people and made them poor. Then they have to be supplied with cattle, which is a subsidy to ranchers, and the fact that these people are seen as poor and reliant on handouts becomes justification for further kind of paternalistic policies. And so it's beef is there at every moment, both conceptually and materially.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that basically cattle is seen as trying to turn the Native Americans into cattle ranchers is seen as kind of a way to, I guess, quote unquote, civilize them, right?
Yeah, that's one part I found kind of fascinating and alternately kind of tragic and humorous when you read these debates, these very abstract debates about what are we going to do? What are we going to do with these people? How should we train them? This is very condescending. And what I found so strange about that is they have these debates about theories of civilizational progress, etc. Then if you go and you read what people living in the West are saying about themselves, they're engaging in really complicated debates about whether it's better to be a cattle rancher or a farmer and how that ties into questions of land and location. And at the same time they're having that debate about engagement with American Indian peoples, it's all about abstract social theories. It's a very strange kind of debate.
Yeah, and it's kind of odd to see these debates happening in the latter half of the 19th century when, in the first half, you had famously all the the name is escaping me, the Five Nations, which famously actually did try to actively assimilate, and then they were expelled from their land anyway. I think under Andrew Jackson. Yeah. So it's interesting that they would say, "Oh, we need to civilize them," and have them assimilate, and then at the same time, when those who have tried to assimilate get expelled anyway.
Yeah, one of the things I wonder about throughout this story is, what was then known as Indian Territory and becomes Oklahoma is really a big part of this story, in part because it's between the cattle towns of Kansas and a lot of the ranching in Texas, or ranching that's happening both illegally and with some sanction in what then was Indian Territory. And I wonder about exactly this, and was it kind of how top-down was this plan of land dispossession, particularly at that moment? How much was it a set of unexamined assumptions about civilization, progress, private property, which is at the heart of these debates? And I don't, totally figure that out because it's a bit outside the focus of the book, but what I do see is that cattle are always there, and they're always a way of thinking through some of these debates.
Not to focus too much on the earlier part of your book, because you do touch on several very different periods, but another thing that struck me as really interesting was how you basically emphasized that a lot of Native American nations would live on kind of actually very varied strips of land where some of it would be more open areas that wouldn't have much rainfall, so it was very good for bison. But they would also have land that was much better for, if not straight up cultivation, at least other forms of production and feeding themselves. And then basically they were pushed off onto the cattle lands, while at the same time their main source of food was annihilated.
Yeah, basically,
yeah.
I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, so I was just because we really get through film this a series of assumptions of basically the naturalization of this idea that Plains Indians would live in the plains and would hunt via horses, but that's kind of not that's a kind of corresponds to a very specific time period and set of circumstances, is what your book seems to be emphasizing.
For sure. I mean, just the fact that it's reliant on horses. I mean, this is a post-Columbian exchange kind of world. And I think the other thing that I think is worth thinking about in this story is the extent to which, what I'm trying to do in the book is do two things at once in that beginning part. One is I'm trying to draw just fundamental parallels between the world of cattle ranching and kind of United States power and the world of American Indian power and the bison, right? I basically want to say, look, these systems look the same from one vantage. You have people who are highly mobile on horseback, gathering or farming or whatever with grazing animals that eat grass that stored energy from the sun. On two levels, those are the same, but everything around it is different, and the assumptions that especially white Americans and U.S. citizens took to that were fundamentally different. They believed that one system was primitive and essentially not worth doing, and the other is kind of putting the United States on the march to progress.
And I mean, as you point out, it not only were they in conflict, but they were active. The expansion of cattle came at the exact the explicit cost of the destruction of the bison as a food source.
Yeah, and often hunters and early cattle ranchers were the same people. I mean, I think there's a temptation to think, okay, there's the hunters and then there's ranchers, they're different, but actually there was a lot of overlap. And the other thing I try to say is that there's no process of the plains being swept clear by the military and perhaps early hunters and then ranching spreads. This is all happening at once and all kind of mixed together.
Right. And your book does a really good job of emphasizing how many of them were they were going after their economic interest, which is just driving them to just participate in this process of destruction.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I wonder about is, when I read these sources of these diaries of people like Susan Newcomb, who moves to the plains of Texas to kind of try her hand with her husband, their hand at ranching. The interesting thing is, they never really examine their assumptions particularly closely. And B, I think what's a big part of it is they're essentially foot soldiers, but they're pretty miserable too. And so they see this kind of ongoing conflict as just, I don't know, they're just state of being. And it's very strange when you try to dig into that ideology.
Yeah, for sure. It's not, because a lot of people who are moving west and moving into these precarious and very isolated settlements, they are all often fleeing situations where they would have been worse off if they had been landless on the East Coast, and so it was kind of the kind of the structures of how the economy worked was kind of pushing people west and having them participate in this process of expansion while not necessarily, as you say, not particularly happy themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideology of settler colonialism that's behind this is enormously complicated and obviously there's a lot of great work on that. And I think, yeah, I mean, I was basically, these people are agents of a violent and in many ways genocidal process, and climbing inside their head and how they understand that it's not easy. And I think it's a kind of strange world they're in.
So one of the things you emphasize in your book is how, a lot of cattle, not just production, but consumption was very geographically, limited. So we're now in the late 19th century. We're now into the age of the expansion, the almost explosion of the railroads, which really changes how a lot of this worked. How did the eruption of all these railroads kind of like change this? I mean, it changed the dynamics of this already like advancing process of cattle ranching.
Yeah, I think what the railroads do is they if we go back to the commodity history perspective, they kind of accelerate the mobility of commodities. And I think one thing that does is that standardizes the kind of engagement with that commodity. What I mean is, at the beginning of my story, how much meat you ate depended a lot on A, where in the U.S. you lived, and B, kind of where in the social and economic hierarchy you were. The railroads start to get rid of that geographic distinction, right? You can, functionally living in Chicago is the same pretty much is the same in terms of for beef access as living in New York or Boston. Now, there is this whole problem of the fact that in the aftermath of the American Civil War, the nation's rail network was very much oriented east-west along a kind of across the northern United States from Chicago to the northeast. And of course, the cattle are on a north-south axis across the plains, and then there's Midwestern cattle ranching. And before the railroads really spread to that western part of the plains, you have the long cattle drive, immortalized in lots of films, connecting all this together, connecting Midwestern ranches, northern ranches, Midwestern cities. And so railroads kind of help promote the integration of a national market in that way. But of course, they don't say who will dominate that system. They don't say who will win, who will lose. They don't say how that will shape American society. And so the conflict I tell in the book tries to understand how the railroads precipitated that and then how the conflict shaped it.
Right, because like the railroads are... The railroads as a process, though, a lot of there was public funding at times. It ended up being very dominated by a small number of companies, right, which were able to use those monopolies.
Yeah, and basically financial capital. And the funny thing about my story is that the railroads themselves are very skeptical. Once we get to the Chicago meatpacker end of the story, the food processors who kind of brought mass industrial beef, the railroads are very suspicious because they're invested in shipping live cattle from Chicago eastward. And so they kind of force the meatpackers to go out on their own. And in doing that, the meatpackers make investments that ultimately mean they can kind of control the railroads once they're powerful enough. But initially, there's a lot of friction between railroad power and kind of meatpacking Chicago power.
Yeah, and in all this process, the group that kind of gets weaker and weaker is the position of the ranchers themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think all throughout this whole commodity chain, the ranchers are struggling, traditional butchers are struggling, workers are struggling, but I think the thing for the ranchers is that what the meatpacking firms in Chicago, when they're gaining power, they realize that abstraction is kind of the key to their profit. And the ranchers are stuck dealing with physical animals. And so whereas meatpackers, might be able to purchase cattle in multiple cities and kind of play cities off each other, a rancher actually has a physical herd of animals and they can't really move as well. And so they really end up victims of this increasing mobility. Right.
Yeah, they're far more vulnerable and dependent on their specific circumstances.
Yeah, because I just add one thing. If you think about how fast the railroads are relatively, well, the telegraph is even faster, and those technologies are closely linked.
Yeah, it's transportation and communication just changing how consumption works. So how did the advances in industrialization change this dynamic? Because of course, we not only have advances in like communication and transport that kind of been ongoing since the 1830s or thereabouts, but you also have in the late 19th century the advances in refrigeration and other kinds of processes.
Yeah, so I think the key is that, and there's a particular story I tell in the book about this attempt to have corporate cattle ranches, and it's kind of a boom and bust. And they all start going out of business, kind of at the same time these Chicago firms are getting big. And what industrialization does is basically there's an abundance of cattle in Chicago. There's an increasingly national market for cattle, and so there's huge amounts of live cattle accumulating in places like Chicago. And these meatpacking firms in Chicago realize that if they can keep meat chilled, they can basically slaughter it centrally, realize huge economies of scale on these very vibrant cattle markets in Chicago, start to develop markets for the animal byproducts, and then efficiently and cheaply ship the processed meat. Now, that requires refrigeration. It also requires kind of new advances in how you take apart an animal, the disassembly line. The disassembly line in the slaughterhouse was pioneered in places like Cincinnati earlier dealing with pork, but the meat packers in Chicago really refine it, and this becomes a model actually for the assembly line in the 20th century. Henry Ford talks about watching the Chicago meat packers as giving him inspiration for his assembly lines. But the thing I do say about the assembly line is it doesn't magically make things more efficient. It actually helps you, basically exploit labor more totally, and that's kind of the key of what increases the productivity and industrialization.
Yeah, it's a shift from a more kind of like an artisanal approach to both production and like preparation and all the rest to a much more brutal but and capital intensive but efficient form of industrializing it. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, I wouldn't even try to pretend like the artisanal or the kind of general purpose approach is a better way to do it in terms of a variety of outcomes. I mean, this just breaks that into tiny steps, trains people quickly, and allows you to just force people all to work at the same speed. Maybe you pay a few people to work faster, so everyone has to. And it just means you can basically work people nearly to death.
And it sounds like it played a key role in the rise of Chicago's economy as well.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think, that you can't just see just meatpacking. I mean, it's a variety of industries. But yeah, I mean, all this wealth is flowing to Chicago. Chicago's population boom is both a cause and a consequence of this. I mean, I think of Chicago as in all the good and ill things this could possibly mean as like a bit like San Francisco today. That like if you're a business person, not finance, but if you're a business person, you're like going there to try to start your business and kind of develop new industrial processes.
So throughout this process, we're looking at the what's it called, the production side and the processing side in terms of how does this change how it is being consumed in America at the time?
Yeah, I mean that's a really important part of the story. My challenge, I think, is commodity histories increasingly. They talk about looking at both production and consumption. It's actually very hard. Every commodity history will say they try this and then try it and have varying degrees of success. I don't know if I was successful, but that's the hardest thing I think to do is to link both production and consumption. But what I tried to do when I thought about it is, at first I thought I would find a story of like meat packers having to convince people to eat all this beef because they're producing so much. But what I realized is for a lot of people in the United States in the 19th century, and particularly recent immigrants from a variety of places, including Europe, beef was really kind of a special occasion food. You might have it on a religious holiday or a few times a year. And so what beef meant to people in the late 19th century didn't so much change, but their ability to have it all the time did. So a special occasion food became an all-the-time food. And first of all, this meant there was huge amounts of demand for producers. But the other thing this meant is that beef became kind of a metric by which you could measure your success as an American, right? So your ability to have beef all the time was a key metric for your Americanization. Similarly, workers thought it was a metric to measure their kind of standard of living. So I found this kind of interesting pamphlet called Meat versus Rice. It was a pamphlet advocating Chinese exclusion, that is to say, preventing Chinese immigration to the United States. But this kind of racist pamphlet made the argument that the American worker lives on beef, and this is in their reading, the Chinese worker lives on rice, and if you bring in workers who live on rice, you'll drag down the level of the American worker. And so this is an argument about immigration and about labor, but the prism is beef and the ability to have beef. And so the fact that people had these expectations is what fueled the kind of ongoing demand for Chicago-dressed beef. And the other thing you see at the period, just briefly, is that elite Americans are very anxious about this. So at the same time workers are saying we need and deserve beef for our standard of living, elite Americans are starting to study poor Americans' diets and saying, why are they insisting on the, fancy porterhouse steak when they could have the round steak or just avoid meat altogether?
Yeah, this actually reminds me. It's not, what you're saying has a lot of parallels to Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power, and how he describes how sugar, which was I think he's an anthropologist originally.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, and how he described how sugar was originally a luxury good, and how even as sugar consumption increased among working class people in England specifically, is what he mostly looks at. It basically the fact that it was a luxury good was also a symbolically significant. So you would have all this elite resistance to the expansion of sugar consumption, even though eventually just it becomes a staple of the British diet.
Well, I think this is really important, and he's really a pioneer in this kind of work. I think the idea is, right, if you've had everything you could ever want, so you're kind of an elite for your whole life, well, then what you consume can just depend on your tastes and whims. But when you don't have as much money and you have to choose, being able to access some of these things becomes a good way of showing who you are and showing your success or your hard work. And so it takes on this kinds of consumption take on special meanings for poorer Americans, and they insist on access to this. And at the same time, I saw this story of kind of, as they said at the time, the common laborer having all the beef they wanted. You see elite Americans looking for new ways to differentiate themselves. They're going to fancier restaurants. They're cooking more elaborate preparations. They're having these kinds of weird parties that I called beef steaks, where they go and young men drink huge quantities of beer and steak in a kind of simultaneously, in their minds, primitive but also refined setting where they're kind of networking with each other.
Yeah, it really is interesting because it's not just, it's not just an economic, like the economics have changed and now people can afford beef. It's also, you're having this not entirely rational but symbolic struggle over what beef can signify.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about this because I think beef really brings this out, and I think food really brings this out, but I guess it's true of all commodities, basically. We use them to make meaning in our world. And to the extent that we kind of create those immediate meanings around us with either our clothes or our food, that has a tendency to kind of elide the kind of longer term or deeper meanings or the longer history of its production. And so this is one way I try to link the production or the consumption and production stories. I argue that process of creating cultural meanings kind of immediately with commodities has a tendency to obscure the production history, which can then be used by producers to justify how they're making things.
Yeah. By the way, just as out of curiosity, how do you feel about the fact that your topic is also kind of one of the issues at the forefront of a different discussion, which is the climate change issue? With because you have the expansion of all this cattle production and the increase of methane and CO2 and all the rest.
Well, I think it is interesting. I mean, obviously, the people at my time did not have any conception of any of these debates. And, I like to think of doing history in general as you're providing a historical narrative, you're providing material, you're providing arguments that then people thinking about debates today can kind of draw from and think about. I want people thinking about the things today to kind of think with this book, hopefully, in a best case scenario. But of course, also people are constantly like asking you or wanting you to think about it, and there's a temptation. I mean, I like to say we can get some lessons from this story for thinking about climate change. Thinking about how, industry and food processors are increasingly separate from the act of actually raising an animal or growing a crop. But, I think this can inform some of that, but I don't want to go too overboard. But I definitely think it's an interesting aspect.
Yeah. Just like it must have been just kind of like surreal to see like your topic and then like different period, but it's constantly in the news.
Yeah, well, I think I guess it's like it makes sense. I mean, people even then knew that beef was extremely resource intensive. So I guess it's no coincidence, I think.
What would you say now that your book has come out, and I think it's been pretty well received, it seems to me.
I think so. I hope so. I think, and I very much appreciate that you were listening to the audiobook, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a really good the book, and I really liked Princeton University Press's little ad. They did an ad for it with graphics and everything.
The ad is really great. I was kind of nervous about the ad at first because it obviously simplifies the arguments hugely, but I've been really happy with how it turned out.
But so now that your book has come out and now that we're talking about it and it's helping push the discussion forward, what do you see as kind of some of the major challenges on the study of this topic, the understanding of this topic, moving forward?
Interesting question. I'm going to think for a second, take advantage of the podcast format.
Or kind of like challenges to your field, things that are kind of like left undone or that should be explored more.
Well, I think certainly if you talk about the immediate topic, I think the globalization of the beef industry in the 20th century and that's an important specific topic. More concretely and perhaps more technically, I think the big challenges that commodity history faces, and I think global history faces as well, or any history, are questions of scale. How a big theme of the book is trying to take big abstract transformations and kind of put them at the human level and try to argue they grow out of human level conflict, kind of on the ground, as it were. But I think conceptualizing questions of scale is really hard, and I think historians have a lot of work to do in refining how they think about and talk about scale, particularly because any story you tell kind of naturalizes a certain a certain stance towards the material. So I tried to not make the business end of the story the center of it, or the consumption end. But it's really hard to do. I think at the end of the day, this book does maybe privilege the production side a bit more. And only at the end gets into the consumption. I tried to do that justice, but it's kind of inevitable. And I think that's definitely a challenge historians will face. I think the other thing that both environmental history and history of capitalism faces is how to think about how we got to our present moment of ecological collapse, and how we can maybe continue to inform those, but also be informed by them. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, how so? Elaborate.
Well, I think we were getting into this a bit. We see this crisis of climate change. My people at the time weren't thinking in those terms, and yet I think there's a relationship between industrial processes and capital and what, for want of a better word, is nature. And I tried to think about that relationship, but I didn't totally figure it out. And I think if we can understand that very concretely, I think it will have a lot to say about today's challenges. I think there's something about the unpredictability and almost irrationality of ecological processes. And I think that conflicts with the need of capital, or at least business, for some kind of rationality. And in my story, and in agribusiness in general, they solve that by making the kind of business side of the story very much the producers and the processors, pushing that risk and unpredictability of nature onto people who actually physically raise the animals and grow the crops. And that tension allows a lot of ecological collapse and degradation to happen. But I don't know how to solve that, I guess one way to say is, like, I still don't know how I feel about this question of centralization in agriculture. And I think other people maybe can try to piece that together.
Yeah, there's definitely, more like in the Americas, it seems really apparent, this simultaneous issue of, like, you have these different booms. You have the plantation boom, you have the cattle boom, you have all these booms, and a lot of the systems which, from the outset, there's not really necessarily a consciousness of how sustainable or not they are, but they have this huge environmental impact. And then, but because of the fact that there was all this land, many times because the Native Americans who had lived there had been removed or killed, and then because there's all that land, the externalization of these costs doesn't really become apparent until later.
Yeah, basically you run out of you run out of new places to exploit, and then you lead to disaster. And I don't know. I can't decide if basically the conclusion... initially my conclusion was that the end result of all of this is basically we're living on borrowed time. On the other hand, I think, well, then, is in food now, is decentralization a solution? What if markets were smaller? Would that help at some of these questions? Well, yeah, but then I don't know how you kind of give people the food that makes them happy, or even feed people who live in massive cities. All these kinds of questions of scale and centralization and decentralization, those are things I think I tried to explore in the book, but I really am curious how we're going to think about those moving forward.
Yeah. A huge part of the battle is asking the question.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging.
If you can't conceptualize the problem, you can't begin to address it, right?
Yeah, well, that's encouraging.
So, aside from, obviously, your book, what would you see as kind of some encouraging advancements within your field of late?
I mean, I think in terms of environmental history, commodity history, I think a few things. I think one is a general turn in the humanities towards environmental questions. I think that's really important. I also think that I think global history has been really valuable for this, for understanding other kinds of contexts, but I also just think work, kind of over time, the increasing amount of work done in different places on these questions is allowing us to start aggregating some of these things. And that's been really encouraging. I would love a book, and as far as I know, this does not currently exist, that is basically this same book written about Argentina. I would love to read that. And I think, that would be amazing. And so I think that kind of stuff, there are, versions of that starting to happen. Global history is really piecing things together. For instance, a few years ago, that book about guano by Greg Cushman was really fantastic about trying to put kind of spaces and places differently. I think books that think very concretely about place, like in my field, Kristen Hoganson's book on the Midwest is doing this. That's been really helpful because it's a kind of book about a place that also embeds it in broader networks and places. I think that kind of work that really thinks about scale and brings new areas into the conversation is really going to let us kind of continue to work on this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It's but yeah, it really is coming back to your book. It really is interesting to see how what's it called, the idealized basically how all these the rancher who is so often romanticized and idealized in a lot of fiction and things like that, and his role is really not necessarily a very comfortable or positive one, or even one which had a lot of government protection or support compared to these other interests. So it's I think this is like the kind of history that's really interesting and even important in re-examining a lot of kind of the romanticized assumptions we have about our past.
Yeah, and I think ranching is very interesting on this point, because I think I tried to write a book that is deeply sympathetic to the place ranchers find themselves in today and root that in these processes in the early 20th century, late 19th. But at the same time, I also do have to talk about the role of cattle ranching in this brutal process of dispossession and impoverishment and violence. So it kind of, I don't know, maybe it's the kind of approach that makes everyone mad at you, but I'm trying to kind of do both those things at once. As one, by the way, a plug and an aside is for all of these things and for historical work, I think also we can draw a lot from related fields, and this is why interdisciplinary approaches are so important. I think both geography, as well as anthropology, the work of someone like Anna Singh has really influenced my own work. She wrote this commodity history about matsutake mushrooms called The Mushroom at the End of the World. And she's telling both a global history, but one that's also fragmentary. And I think some of these other fields, what they're able to do is kind of think about general processes abstractly and maybe test out ideas. And then as historians, we can think with those and kind of look at them in the past and maybe really add some texture to that. And so I think by kind of mixing these fields together, and that's what I meant by, the humanities in general, thinking about environments and capitalism, I think we can really gain a lot collectively.
For sure. Well, great. I think our listeners have a pretty good introduction to this topic. I encourage folks to read Red Meat Republic, available now out of the Princeton University Press. Professor Specht, thanks again for coming on.
Andreas, thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.